Rosie Carter slapped the man so hard the whiskey flew clean out of his hand and hit the frozen dirt 20 feet away. The crack of it rang up and down that black hollow street like a rifle shot, and for one long suspended second, nobody on that boardwalk breathed. Not the rancher clutching his jaw. Not the women frozen along the storefronts. Not the children pressing between wagon wheels to get a better look. And not the tall, quiet man standing at the far edge of the crowd. The man who had placed that newspaper advertisement. The man who was supposed to be her husband watching her with something that nobody in Black Hollow had ever once seen on Elias Boone's face before. If this is your first time finding this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Black Hollow, Montana, and the day Rosie Carter arrived and refused to disappear. The stagecoach had been 6 days late out of Denver, and Rosie had counted every hour of it. She'd sat on that hard bench with her wool coat pressed against strangers who never once shifted to give her more room. Her fingers locked around the handle of her one good suitcase, like it was the last solid thing in her life. Because it was. Everything else, the rented room in Chicago, the job at Graves Manufacturing, the small circle of women who'd been kind to her before the trouble started, all of it was gone. What remained was a suitcase, a coat with a hidden seam sewn into the lining, and a name on a piece of newspaper she'd torn out 6 weeks ago and carried until the edges went soft. Elias Boone, Black Hollow, Montana. She knew his facts the way she always learned the facts about things she needed to survive carefully without romance. 41 years old. Former Union soldier. 300 acres north of town with a cabin he'd built himself after the war. One previous wife deceased. No children. He needed someone to keep the household through the winter, said the advertisement. He was not looking for companionship. He was not promising anything beyond a roof and fair treatment. Fair treatment. She'd read that part twice. She hadn't had much of it in her life. The door of the stagecoach swung open in Black Hollow, and the mountain air hit her like something physical, cold and sharp and thin, in a way that Chicago air never was. Like the altitude had taken something out of it that she wasn't ready to do without. She gripped the doorframe and stepped down, and her heel found a patch of black ice, and she lurched hard against the wheel, spoke before she caught herself. And in that moment of stumbling, that one graceless second, the street of Black Hollow saw her. She heard the laughter before she was fully upright. Not quiet laughter. Not the kind decent people swallow because they know better. This was open, shameless laughter, the kind that comes from people who have never once been laughed at themselves, and so have never developed any instinct to hold it back. She heard it from the saloon doorway. She heard it from a cluster of men near the livery. She heard a woman on the boardwalk say something to another woman in a low voice that made both of them press their hands over their mouths. Rosie straightened up. She smoothed her coat. She picked her suitcase up off the step and held it at her side. She had been hearing that laughter her entire life. She was 34 years old, and she had been hearing it since she was 8, when she first understood that her body was the thing other people decided to have opinions about before they ever bothered to know her name. She had heard it in schoolrooms and on street corners and in the fabric store on Halsted, where the woman behind the counter always made a point of saying loudly that they didn't carry her size. She had heard it from men who thought humiliating a woman in public was the same thing as being funny. She had heard it so many times that she had built something around it, not armor exactly, more like a second skin, a layer of steadiness that looked like indifference to people who didn't know her, and felt on the inside like holding a door shut against a wind that never stopped blowing. She held that door shut now. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin and began walking toward the center of the street to look for the man from the advertisement. The man who stepped out of the saloon was wide through the chest, red in the face, and drunk enough that his boots were finding creative paths across the frozen ground. He had the look of a man who'd been the loudest person in every room he'd ever walked into, and had mistaken that for being the most important. He took one look at Rosie Carter standing in the middle of Black Hollow's main street with her suitcase in her hand and her coat straining at the buttons, and he grinned the particular grin of a man who believes he has found something safe to destroy. "Well, Lord Almighty," he said, pitching his voice for the whole street to enjoy. "Old Elias done sent away for a mail-order bride, and they went ahead and sent him a whole dang wagon." The laughter that followed was worse than his words, because his words were just words, and she'd heard words like that 1,000 times. But laughter from a crowd has its own physics. It spreads, it amplifies it, turns individual cruelty into something that feels collective and inevitable, like the world is simply agreeing on a fact. Rosie set her suitcase down. She turned and she faced him. She looked at him with that steadiness that most people mistook for patience, and that had never been patience at all. "Say it again," she said. He blinked. That wasn't what women said back. He opened his mouth to oblige her, and she covered the ground between them in 4 steps and hit him open-palmed across the jaw with everything she had in her arm and her shoulder and every year of her life that had built up behind it. The crack of it rang like a shot. The whiskey tumbled end over end through the cold air. His head snapped sideways. He stumbled back into the saloon door, hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame, and then he stood there gripping his face and staring at her with the expression of a man who has just encountered a fact about the world that his understanding of it had not accounted for. The street went completely silent. Rosie reached down and picked up her suitcase. "My name," she said. And she said it clearly. And she said it without raising her voice, because a woman who raises her voice is nervous, and she was not going to be nervous in front of these people. "Is Rosie Carter. And the next man who opens his mouth at me that way is getting the other hand." She turned her back on Tom Haley. That was the hardest part. Turning her back on him when everything in her body was screaming to keep watching, to keep guarding. She turned her back on him anyway, because she had learned long ago that letting people see you brace for them is just another kind of surrender, and she walked toward the center of the street, and she looked for Elias Boone. She found him because he was the only person not laughing. He stood at the far edge of the gathered crowd, with his hat in both hands, watching her. He was lean, the way mountain country makes men lean, not thin, but stripped down, as though the altitude and the winters had taken everything from him that wasn't necessary and left only what was. He was dark-eyed and weathered, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with yesterday's sleep. There was a scar along his jaw that she noticed and then set aside. He was looking at her face, not at her body, not at the places her coat pulled tight, her face. He stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who'd learned to be careful with what he put into words because he didn't have many to spend. "Mr. Boone," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something you are genuinely trying to understand without performance and without judgment. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." "Tom Haley," he said, nodding slightly in the direction behind her. "Does that. Gets into his afternoon drinking and does that. I noticed. You didn't have to hit him. I'm aware of that." A beat of quiet. He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'm glad you did," he said. There was no wink behind it, no smile angling for charm. He said it the way he'd say the temperature or the distance to town, flat and factual and honest, and she looked at him for a second longer than she'd intended to. "Where's your wagon?" she asked. "North end of town. I'll take your bag." "I've got it." He nodded like that was the most sensible answer he'd heard all day and turned to walk. She followed. Behind them, the street of Black Hollow slowly remembered how to breathe. She could hear the whispering start up as they walked the resuming commentary. Tom Haley's companions deciding the whole thing was funnier now that the initial shock had passed, and she kept her eyes straight and her grip on the suitcase steady, and she put one boot in front of the other on the frozen ground, and she did not look back. The wagon was a working wagon, bare wooden bench tools and feed sacks, in the bed coil of rope along the side rail. She climbed up without waiting for help. He went around to the other side and took up the reins, and they pulled away from Black Hollow and the whispering and the cold, cruel laughter, and for the first mile neither of them said a word. She spoke first. "How far to the cabin?" 4 hours in good weather. He studied the sky without looking away from the road. "Snow's coming. Could be 5. She looked up at the sky the same way he had, reading the color of it, the weight of it. She didn't know mountain skies yet, but she had always been a quick study about things that mattered. The advertisement said household management, she said. Cooking, preserving, tending the animals. That's right. I can do all of that. Ever done it at this altitude? No. It's different up here. The cold gets into things in a way you don't expect. The work is harder than it looks, and it looks hard. She turned and looked at him directly. He was watching the road. Mr. Boone, she said, I was raised in Chicago by a father who worked 16 hours a day in a factory that paid him half what it owed him and kept the rest. My mother died when I was 9. I started taking in mending work at 11 to help with rent, and I have worked every single day since then, doing whatever needed doing without asking whether it was too hard first. She paused. I am not fragile. He didn't answer right away. The horses found their rhythm climbing the road. The pines thickened. I can see that, he said. What I am, she continued, is honest. I will tell you what I can do and what I can't, and I won't complain about either. I'd ask the same from you. He glanced at her, then a quick measuring look. I'm a man of few words, he said. I noticed. I mean, I don't talk much. Most folks find it uncomfortable. I find excessive talking uncomfortable, she said. We may suit each other fine. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not yet, maybe not ever. She didn't know enough about him, but a loosening, like a rope that's been pulled too tight, being given a half-inch of slack. You always like this, he said. Like what? Straight-spoken. Would you prefer I wasn't? No, he said. No, I wouldn't. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less the silence of two strangers, and more the silence of two people who have established enough about each other to stop testing the air between them. The snow began about 2 hours into the climb. Not gentle, committed the way Montana snow means to stay, and she pulled her coat tighter and watched it come, and didn't remark on it, because there was nothing useful to say about snow you can't stop. Once on a steep section of road where the horses had to work hard and the wagon swayed, her hand went unconsciously to the inside of her coat, not cold, not reaching for warmth, just pressing against the place where she'd sewn the extra seam, where 3 folded sheets of paper rested against her ribs. She felt Elias notice. She could tell without looking a small shift in his posture, the quality of his stillness, changing for just a moment. He didn't say anything. He returned his attention to the horses and the road and the thickening dark between the pines. She moved her hand back to her lap. The cabin came into view just as the snow began coming down in earnest. She looked at it the way she looked at everything new, practically without sentiment, measuring what it was against, what she would need it to be. It was solid and low and well built by someone who understood what mattered in a mountain winter and hadn't wasted effort on what didn't. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant he'd banked a fire before leaving that morning. The woodpile was deep and dry under its tarpaulin. The barn sat 15 feet to the left. She climbed down from the wagon into the snow. Loft is yours, Elias said, pulling her suitcase from the bed. I'm below. It's warmer up there. Chimney runs right through the middle of it. That's fine. Elk stew on the stove. Made this morning. He paused like he felt some obligation to qualify it. It's not fancy. I'm not looking for fancy, she said. He held the door open. She walked inside. The stew was better than anything she'd eaten in 6 weeks on the road. She ate without speaking, and he ate without speaking, and the fire burned, and the snow came down outside, and the quiet between them was the particular quiet of two people who have both learned through different means and different wounds that silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's just two people being real with each other without having to perform it. After the dishes were cleared, he sat across the table from her with his hands resting flat on the wood, and he said, You said you needed to leave Chicago. I did. You want to tell me why? She looked at him. He wasn't pushing. His face was open and still, and without demand. Not tonight, she said. He nodded once. All right. "But I will," she said. "When it's time." "It's your business," he said. "You don't owe me your history." "You're my husband," she said. The word landed between them. He went very still. "On paper," he said carefully. "That's what the advertisement was for. I won't pretend it's more than that, or ask you to." "What would you want it to be?" she said. "If you could want anything." The question caught him somewhere unguarded. She could see it, that brief moment when a man who has spent years keeping himself closed off encounters a question that doesn't have a rehearsed answer. He looked at the fire. "I don't know," he said. "I stopped asking myself things like that a while back." "Why?" "Because the answer hurt." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the snow came down and the cabin held its warmth. "You don't have to answer it tonight either," she said. That almost smile moved through his face again. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow I'll walk you through the place. Animal stores the well, all of it. You need to know it before the real cold sets in." "When does the real cold set in?" He looked at her steadily. "About 3 weeks ago," he said. The sound came out of her before she could stop it, a short, genuine snort of laughter that surprised her as much as it surprised him. She pressed her lips together. He looked at the table. There was that loosening in his face again. "Good night, Mr. Boone," she said, and picked up the lamp. "Elias?" he said. She stopped. "If we're going to be married on paper," he said, "might as well use first names." She stood at the foot of the loft stairs with the lamp in her hand, and she looked at this man, this quiet, worn-down, unexpectedly decent man, who had not laughed at her in the street, who had said he was glad she'd hit Tom Haley, who had asked if she was all right before he asked anything else. And she thought about all the men she'd known in her life who had seemed one way and been another entirely. She didn't know yet which kind Elias Boone was. She intended to find out. "Good night, Elias," she said. She climbed to the loft and set the lamp on the small table beside the bed. A real bed with a real quilt pieced from old wool and flannel, which she hadn't expected, and she sat on the edge of it and reached inside her coat and drew out the folded papers. 3 sheets. Nathaniel Graves' careful hand, all those numbers and names and dates and amounts, the ledger of a man who had spent 15 years stealing wages from factory workers and paying judges to look the other way, and ruining any woman or man who threatened to say so publicly. Her father's name was on the second page. 3rd row down, in a column of men who'd had hours falsified and complaints buried and lives quietly diminished by a man with enough money to decide what was true. Her father had gone to his grave believing no one would ever see those numbers. Rosie Carter had copied them by candlelight in Graves's private office on a Thursday night in February, when the building was empty and she had 40 minutes before the night watchman made his second round. She had been running ever since. She folded the papers carefully, tucked them back into the hidden seam, and lay back on the quilt and pulled it to her chin. She listened to the snow against the window and the fire settling below and the vast indifferent silence of a Montana mountain closing in around the cabin from every direction. She was 4 states from Chicago. She was married to a man she'd met 3 hours ago. She had no money and no allies and no clear plan beyond getting those papers to the federal marshal's office in Helena before Nathaniel Graves followed the trail she'd left, and she knew he would follow it. He had the money to follow anything. She had a suitcase and 3 sheets of paper and 34 years of being told she was too much for the world to comfortably hold. She closed her eyes. She had survived everything that had come at her so far. She intended to keep doing exactly that. She woke before dawn to the sound of an axe. The rhythm of it came up through the cabin walls, steady, unhurried, the sound of a man who had done this 10,000 mornings and would do it 10,000 more. And Rosie lay still for a moment listening to it, and then she swung her legs off the bed and started getting dressed. The cold hit her feet the moment they touched the floor. Not Chicago cold, not the damp gray cold she'd grown up with, which at least had the decency to be honest about what it was. This was something deeper, something that came from altitude and open sky, and the absence of everything that usually cushions a person from the actual temperature of the world. She went downstairs and found coffee on the stove. She drank it standing. When she pushed the cabin door open, the air went into her lungs like a fistful of needles. Elias was at the woodpile. He glanced up when the door opened, looked at her standing in the cold. Without her coat, she'd left it on the peg, in her determination to be up and useful before him, and set the axe against the block without a word. "You forgot your coat," he said. "I noticed," she said. "Go get it." "I'll be fine." "At this altitude," he said, "you'll be sick by noon. Go get it." She went and got it. When she came back, he had already split 4 more pieces and stacked them. And he didn't comment on the coat, or the forgetting of it, or any of it, just held out a pair of leather work gloves and pointed at the far end of the pile. "Stack what I split," he said. "Tight or it falls." She stacked. He split. The cold worked on her ears and fingers, even through the gloves, and the thin air put an ache in the back of her throat that she didn't remember putting there. And after 20 minutes, her arms were burning in a way she didn't want Elias to see. He saw it. "Stop," he said. She kept stacking. "Rosie." Flat and direct. "Stop and breathe. You're fighting the altitude and losing." "I'm fine. You're about to pass out, and I'll have to carry you inside, and neither of us wants that." He set the axe down and looked at her with no trace of mockery anywhere on his face. "Sit on that log. 2 minutes. Just breathe. It's not weakness, it's physics. Your body doesn't know how to work up here yet." She sat. She breathed. The air still felt insufficient, like trying to fill a room with a candle. "How long does it take?" she said. "To get used to it." 3 weeks, maybe 4. And until then, you go slower than you think you should, and you stop arguing with your own lungs about it." She looked at him. "Is that what you do?" "I've been up here 6 years, he said. "I don't think about it anymore." 6 years alone. A pause, small and exact. 6 years, he said, and left the word alone where she'd said it. She let it go. She would learn which of his silences were doors and which were walls. That one felt like a wall, and she would respect it until he opened it himself. After 2 minutes, she stood up and went back to the woodpile, and he watched her for exactly 1 second before picking up the axe and going back to work. And something in his simple return to the task, without commentary, without the brand of surprised approval that condescends. While it compliments, settled something in her chest that she hadn't realized was unsettled. By the end of the first week, she had a system. She was up before him. Coffee made and stove stoked before he came downstairs. She learned the rhythm of the animals. 2 horses, 4 chickens, a barn cat, that accepted her by the 3rd day and regarded Elias with personal indifference. And she learned the stores, the root cellar, the way the well chain had to be handled in the freeze, the particular lift and pull the cabin door needed before it would latch against the north wind. She cataloged everything the way she always had, because knowing the layout of a place was how she survived rooms she'd never been in, and this cabin was simply a room she hadn't been in yet. But the mountain was different. The mountain had no logic she could catalog from inside. On the 8th day, Elias took her out into the pines above the cabin to walk the trail to the high meadow where he tracked elk. A mile, maybe a mile and a half. Nothing she couldn't walk in Chicago in 20 minutes. But the altitude and the snow and the cold worked on her from 3 directions at once, and by the halfway point her thighs were shaking, and her lungs were doing the work of bellows on a failing fire, and she stopped and pressed her hand against a pine trunk and did not look at Elias. "Go ahead," she said. "I'll follow." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and stopped beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. "I'm slowing you down." "You're learning the trail," he said. "That takes as long as it takes." She looked at him then. He was watching the trees above them with that quiet, reading attention of his. Not looking at her with pity, not performing patience, just standing there like a man who had nowhere else to be and had decided this was where he was. "In Chicago," she said. And she didn't know why she said it, except that the altitude had thinned something in her. People looked at me and decided what I could and couldn't do before I ever opened my mouth. "I know the type," he said. "Does it bother you that I'm slower up here?" He turned and looked at her directly. "Does it bother me that you've been in the mountains 8 days and you're twice as far up this trail as I expected?" He said it flat the way he said everything. "No, Rosie, it does not." She looked at the trail above them. She pushed off the tree and started climbing again. He fell in beside her. When they reached the high meadow, and she stood there breathing hard and looked out over the valley, the tiny scattered shapes of Black Hollow far below the Rockies, rolling out in every direction like a country God made and then forgot to put a fence around, she felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for yet. Not triumph. Quieter than that. Something that had to do with her body and what it had just done, and the complete and total absence for the first time she could remember of anyone's opinion about it. "It's something," Elias said beside her. "Yes," she said. "It is." The rifle came on the 11th day. He set it on the table after supper, and she looked at it and then at him. "You need to know how to use it," he said. "Out here everyone does." "I've never fired one." "I know. That's why we're starting tonight." He was patient in the way of a man who'd been badly taught once and had learned from that exactly what not to do, walking her through the mechanism, the weight of it, the respect it required. No condescension, no theater. Just a man explaining a tool to someone who was going to need to use it. The next morning, behind the barn, he set up a row of tin cans on the fence rail. She missed the first 4 by margins she refused to be embarrassed about. "You're flinching before you pull," he said, anticipating the sound. "I know I am. I can't stop." "Close your eyes." She looked at him. "That seems like the wrong direction." "Close your eyes," he said again, "and think about where you want it to go, not about the sound, where you want it to go." She closed her eyes. She pulled. The crack went through her, and the can at the far end flew off the rail and hit the frozen ground 10 feet away. She opened her eyes. "Huh," she said. "Again," he said. By the end of the morning, she had hit 7 out of 12, and Elias had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that had moved past professional assessment and hadn't yet settled into something else, but was clearly in motion. "You've got a good eye," he said. "I spent 20 years watching people without them knowing it," she said. "You learn to see straight." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be all right up here," he said. "I told you that," she said. "I know you did." A pause. "I believe it now." The trip to Black Hollow came on the 14th day. She'd known it was coming and said nothing about it, just climbed into the wagon when the time came and held her head level and watched the road. The town was exactly as she'd left it. Towns didn't change just because you had. She felt them watching as the wagon came down the main street, heard conversations pause and resume in lower registers, saw 2 women outside the dry goods store exchange that particular silent vocabulary of women who have already rendered a verdict. Inside the store, the man behind the counter, Gerald Pratt, the sign said, watched her move through the shelves with a smile that managed to be both perfectly polite and quietly devastating. "Your wife settling in all right, Elias?" he said, directing it at Elias, like she wasn't standing 4 feet away. "Fine," Elias said. "Mountain air treating her well." His eyes went to Rosie and back. "It's no place for someone not accustomed, is what I always say." Elias's voice went flat. "What do you need from me, Gerald?" "Just making conversation. Make it about something else." Pratt's smile held. "Only asking. She know what she signed up for up there. A man like you all alone that long? It must be, Rosie set the jar of molasses down on the counter in front of him. She set it down slowly and without noise, which was more effective than slamming it. "Mr. Pratt," she said, "I've been on that mountain 2 weeks. I've split wood, hauled water from a frozen well, walked a 1.5-mile trail at altitude in snowshoes, and learned to shoot in 3 sessions. She held his gaze without effort. "What I have not learned is how to pretend I don't hear a man talking about me like I'm not standing right in front of him. So if you've got something to say about my fitness for that mountain, say it to my face, and I'll answer you directly. Otherwise, add up our bill." The store was silent. Pratt added up the bill. Outside, Elias held the door for her, and when they were back on the street, he said low, just for her, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I was going to say something." "I got there first." A beat of quiet. "You always do," he said, and there was something in it that had nothing to do with criticism. That night at the table, he said, "Where'd you learn to handle people that way?" She considered the question honestly. "Chicago. You work 7 years in a place like Graves Manufacturing, surrounded by men who believe a woman's job is to stay quiet and look grateful. You learn to handle people, or you disappear." He was still. "Graves Manufacturing," he said. "Yes." "Is that the reason you left Chicago?" She looked at him. The fire crackled. The north wind worked at the cabin with the persistence of something that has all winter to make its point. "Part of it," she said. "And the other part, a man named Nathaniel Graves decided I knew too much." Elias set his coffee down carefully. "Too much about what?" "About what he'd been doing to his workers, for 15 years. She paused. "Including my father." The cabin held that. "He's looking for you," Elias said. Not a question. "Yes." "Does he know where you are?" "Not yet. I was careful." She touched the front of her coat briefly the way she always did when she thought of the papers. "But Nathaniel Graves has enough money to be patient and thorough at the same time, and patient and thorough men find things eventually." Elias looked at the fire for a long moment. "You should have told me this before," he said. "No accusation in it, just fact." "I know. I wasn't sure I could trust you." He looked at her, then straight and level. And now, she looked back at him. This man who had stood beside her on the trail, who had called her fitness to Pratt's face, the plain facts, who had handed her a rifle and told her to trust where she wanted the bullet to go, and she said, "Now I think I can." He nodded once. He looked at the fire again. "All right," he said. "That's all? What do you want me to say?" She thought about it. "Honestly, I don't know," she admitted. "Then, all right is enough for tonight," he said. And he got up and put another log on the fire, and she watched him and thought about what it meant to be in a room with a man who didn't need every silence filled, and realized she had never been in one before. She was still thinking about it when she went up to the loft. 3 days later, on a hard, bright morning, when the sky was the particular blue that only comes with deep cold, she came in from feeding the chickens to find Elias at the table with a letter in front of him, and a look on his face that stopped her in the doorway. "A rider came from town while you were out back," he said. "Gus Holt. He runs messages up the mountain when the weather holds." He kept one hand flat on the letter. "He said a man came into Black Hollow yesterday on the stage from Denver, asking around about a woman who'd traveled alone from Chicago." He paused. "Heavy-set, dark hair. Said she might be using a different name." Rosie stood very still. "Did Gus tell him anything?" she said. "Gus doesn't know anything to tell." Elias looked at her steadily. "Gerald Pratt does." The room shifted under her feet. Not the floor, she was standing solid. She was always standing solid. But something internal, the way ice shifts when the temperature beneath it changes, and the whole structure has to adjust to a new reality. She had been so careful. "How long," she said, "from Black Hollow to this cabin?" 4 hours, he said. "Same as always." "Then he could be here by tonight." "He could," Elias said. He stood up from the table, and his voice was the same as it always was. Unhurried, stripped of theater. But his eyes had changed quality in a way she was learning to read. "Tell me everything," he said. "All of it, right now." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. And she told him, all of it, the ledgers she wasn't supposed to see, the names and the numbers and the 15 years of wage theft and bought judges and buried complaints. The night she'd copied it all by candlelight in Graves's private office, with 40 minutes before the watchman's second round. The morning she'd come in to find 2 men in expensive coats waiting outside her rooming house. The 6 weeks of running St. Louis, then Kansas City, then Denver, then the stagecoach north into the mountains, and the advertisement torn from a newspaper she'd read in a station waiting room. Elias sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his dark eyes steady, and he listened to every word without once interrupting. When she finished, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cold was pressing against the cabin walls with a kind of deliberate intent. He looked at her for a long moment. "You came up here carrying all of that alone," he said. "Yes. And you still came." "I didn't have anywhere else to go." The fire settled. The wind moved around the eaves. "Rosie," he said, and his voice had gone quieter than his usual quiet enough that she leaned slightly forward without meaning to. "You take up space like a wildfire. You understand that—" He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without the inflation of a man trying to be kind. Just true. "Don't you apologize for a single inch of it." She looked at him across the table in the low firelight. This man she had known 18 days, and she felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked for so long she'd forgotten what it weighed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside, the wind had gone still in that sudden way of mountain nights, and the silence it left behind was the particular silence of a country holding its breath, as though the land itself already understood that what was coming for Rosie Carter was going to have to come through this cabin first. And standing in that silence, watching Elias Boone get up and bank the fire with the calm, deliberate movements of a man who has decided something without saying it aloud, Rosie understood something she had not understood before. She had come to this mountain running. She was not running anymore. She didn't sleep. She lay in the loft with her coat folded under her head and her eyes on the ceiling, and she listened to Elias moving below the deliberate, quiet sounds of a man who has decided something and is now executing it without fanfare. She heard the metallic check of his rifle, the slide of the extra box of ammunition across the table, the soft thud of the bar being tested on the front door. He was not panicking. That steadied her more than anything he could have said. She reached inside her coat and touched the papers one more time in the dark. Not from fear, but from something close to resolve, and then she swung her legs off the bed and went downstairs. He was at the table with the rifle broken open in front of him, cleaning it with the focused attention of a man who'd been in enough dangerous situations to understand that the difference between alive and not is usually maintenance. He looked up when she came down. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He looked back at the rifle. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking Graves' man in Black Hollow is a scout. He's not here to take you, he's here to confirm where you are and wire back." He ran the cleaning cloth through the barrel without looking up. "Graves himself won't come until he knows for certain." "How long does that give us?" "If the scout wired Denver tonight, and Graves moves fast 3 days, maybe 4. He paused. "If Gerald Pratt talked this afternoon, the wire's already gone." She absorbed that. "So possibly less." "Possibly less?" he said. "What do you want to do?" He set the rifle down and looked at her directly. "I want to ride to Helena and get those papers to the federal marshal's office before Graves gets anywhere near this mountain." "The roads," she said. "Heavy snow north of here. Could be impassable." He was quiet for a moment. "There's another option." "Tell me." "We stay," he said. "We let him come, and we make sure when he does, it doesn't go the way he's planned." She looked at him across the table. The fire was low, and the light between them was thin and honest. "You'd do that," she said. "Fight them. For me." Something crossed his face that she didn't have a word for yet. "I'd do that," he said, "because what's on those papers is worth fighting for. And because you're my wife." He said it plainly, without drama. "On paper or otherwise." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said. "Then we stay. But I'm not hiding in the loft when they come." He looked at her. "I mean it, Elias. I've been hiding from this man for 6 weeks. I'm done hiding." He studied her face for a long moment, reading her the way he read the sky without illusion. You ever shot at something that shoots back? He said. No, she said. But I hit 7 out of 12 tin cans on my third session, and I'm considerably more motivated now. Something moved through his eyes that was almost a smile. He pushed back from the table and stood up. Get some sleep, he said. I mean it this time. Tomorrow we'll work out the positions. Positions, she said. Where you stand, where I stand, what happens if they come from the east side instead of the road? He said it the way he'd say anything practical level without flinching. This cabin has held through worse than Nathaniel Graves. We just need to give it some help. She went back up to the loft. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep well, but she slept, which was more than she'd expected. And she woke to a gray dawn and the smell of coffee and the particular quality of cold that means the temperature has dropped overnight into territory that doesn't negotiate. They spent the morning quietly. Elias showed her where the second rifle was an older model kept oiled and loaded mounted above the back window, and walked her through the angles of approach to the cabin from every direction. She listened, the way she listened to everything important without interrupting, cataloging, building a picture in her mind that she could access without thinking when she needed it. He showed her where to stand that kept the wall between her and the east window. She showed him she'd understood by taking the position without being asked. He nodded once. By afternoon, they had a plan. By the following morning, the plan had already changed. The sound of hoofbeats came up the mountain road just before noon on the second day. Not the loose, casual rhythm of a single rider making time, but the tight, deliberate pace of men moving in formation. Rosie was at the back window when she heard it, and she crossed to the front in 4 strides without running, and stood beside Elias, who was already at the door with his hand on the bar. How many? She said quietly. 4 horses, he said. Maybe 5. That's more than a scout. That's more than a scout, he agreed. She went to the side window and looked through the gap in the shutter. There was a man on a gray horse at the front of the group, well dressed, even for a mountain road coat, that cost more than most men in Black Hollow, made in a season riding with the particular posture of a man who has spent a lifetime being the most important person in every room he enters. Her stomach went cold and flat. It's him, she said. Elias moved to stand beside her. He looked through the gap. He said nothing. Nathaniel Graves, she said. He came himself. He's confident, Elias said. He's always confident. Her voice was steady, even though her hands weren't, and she pressed them deliberately against her sides. He brought 4 men with him. Those are hired guns, the 2 on the right, see how they're sitting. They're not ranch hands. I see them, Elias said. Graves pulled his horse up 30 yards from the cabin door. He had a voice made for courtrooms and boardrooms, the kind of voice that carries without effort and lands with weight. Mr. Boone, he called out, I have no quarrel with you. Send out the woman, and I'll be on my way. Elias put his hand on the door bar. He looked at Rosie. She shook her head. He looked back at the door. You're on private land, he called back. State your business and be gone. A pause. Then Graves's voice again adjusted slightly, patient, reasonable, the tone he used when he was explaining to someone that they had misunderstood who they were dealing with. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Rosie Carter on charges of theft and fraud, signed by a federal judge in Denver. Another pause. I'm within my legal rights, Mr. Boone. This doesn't have to go badly for you. Rosie felt something cold move through her. A federal warrant. A federal judge. She had known Graves had reach. She had known it for years. But a judge was different. A judge made the papers in her coat worth something only if she could get them to someone who outranked him. What judge? She said low and urgent to Elias. I heard it, he said. He was thinking she could see it in the stillness of him, the way a man looks when he's running through variables quickly. Rosie, he said, those papers of yours, the names on them. Is there a judge? She looked at him. Second page, she said. Bottom of the column. He turned and looked at her fully. Federal. District Court in Denver, she said. $12,000 over 4 years. The air between them changed. "Graves isn't here just to stop you from talking," Elias said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "He's here because that warrant is the only thing standing between him and those papers becoming the thing that brings him down. If the judge who signed it is in the ledger, the warrant's worthless," Elias said, "but only if you can prove it." Outside, Graves called again, and the patience in his voice had thinned by one careful layer. "Mr. Boone, I won't ask again." "You need to stall him," Rosie said. "I know." "Elias." She grabbed his arm before he could move. "There's something I didn't tell you last night." He stopped. 3 weeks ago," she said, "before you told me about the scout, I sent a letter to the federal marshal's office in Helena. I had Gus Holt carry it the last time he was up. I sent a description of the documents and a list of the names on them." She held his eyes. "I didn't send the originals, but I sent enough that a marshal who knew what to look for would start looking." Elias was very still. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know yet if I could trust you," she said. "And because if Graves got to you before I could stop him, I needed you to be able to say honestly that you didn't know." He looked at her for a moment, not with anger, she realized, but with something that was closer to recognition, the look of a man encountering in someone else an instinct for survival that he understands from the inside. "How long for a marshal to ride from Helena?" he said. "Best case 2 days. Worst case they haven't moved yet. So we need to hold this cabin." "We need to hold this cabin," she said. He turned to the door. "Mr. Graves," he called. "That warrant needs to be examined. Ride into Black Hollow and wait while I send for the county sheriff." The pause this time was longer. "I don't think you're in a position to make conditions," Graves said, and the patience was gone, now replaced by the voice he used when the conversation had served its purpose. "Take her out, Boone. Last time." Elias looked at Rosie. She was already moving toward the back window, the older rifle in her hands, getting to the position they'd worked out. She moved without hesitation, without theater, with the particular economy of someone who has decided, and is past the part where deciding is hard. He watched her for 1 second. Then the first shot hit the cabin door. The sound of it was enormous in the enclosed space. A flat, splitting crack, and Rosie felt the shudder of it through the wall beside her. But she didn't move from the position she held the rifle level, and watched the east approach through the gap in the shutter and breathed the way Elias had taught her from the belly slow. "Two coming around the east side," she called out. "I've got the road," he called back. She heard his rifle speak once sharp and definitive, and heard a shout from outside, and the sound of a horse shying sideways. One of Graves's men came around the corner of the barn at a run, and she tracked him through the shutter gap and fired and missed by 4 feet, and worked the lever and fired again, and he dove behind the barn wall and stayed there. "You missed," Elias called. "I know," she called back. "He's behind the barn. He's not moving." Good enough. The next 20 minutes moved in the strange compressed time of a crisis, fast and slow at once, each second distinct and heavy, and gone before she could fully account for it. Graves's men tested the cabin from 3 sides and found no easy angle. Elias was methodical in a way that told her he had done something like this before, somewhere in a war she didn't know the details of, and she was grateful for it without having time to say so. A bullet came through the front wall high and left a hole that let in a finger of bitter cold air and daylight, and she heard Elias swear the first time she'd heard him swear, and she called across to him, and he called back that he was fine before she'd finished asking. They were holding. But holding wasn't winning. She could hear Graves outside, not shooting, not retreating, just waiting with the confidence of a man who has all the resources and knows it. He'd stationed his men at every approach, and he was content to wait them out, let the cold and the ammunition and the trapped feeling do the work for him. Rosie pressed her back against the wall beside the window, and she thought. She thought about the letter she'd sent to Helena. She thought about the names on the second page. She thought about her father's name in the 3rd row, and what it had cost him, and what it was going to cost Nathaniel Graves. And then she heard something. Not from outside, from inside herself, in the place where fear usually lived. The place she'd spent 34 years patching and reinforcing against a world that wanted her small and quiet and manageable. That place was quiet, not empty, not numb. Quiet in the way a decision is quiet after the deciding is done. She crossed the cabin to where Elias was crouched below the front window. He looked at her when she came. "We need him talking," she said. "If he's talking, he's not shooting." "What do you have in mind?" "I'm going to step outside." He went very still. "Absolutely not." "Elias." "Rosie." His voice was low and hard and completely without room in it. "You are not walking out that door." "I'm not surrendering," she said. "I'm negotiating. There's a difference." She held his eyes and made sure he saw the difference in her face. "He wants the papers. As long as I'm inside this cabin, he'll tear it apart brick by brick to get them. If I walk out to him, he has to deal with me directly. And Nathaniel Graves has never once in his life dealt directly with a woman who knew exactly what he'd done." Elias looked at her for a long, hard moment. "The second anything goes wrong," he started. "The second anything goes wrong," she said, "you do what you're best at." She picked up the documents from the inner pocket of her coat. She held them in her hand, 3 folded sheets of paper. 15 years of Nathaniel Graves's careful crimes. Her father's name 3rd row down on the 2nd page, and she felt the weight of them, and the rightness of them, and something that had lived in her chest like a wound for the past 6 weeks began to close. She opened the front door. She stepped out into the cold. Graves was exactly where she expected him to be, mounted, centered, controlling the ground the way he always controlled every room he was in. His 4 men had their weapons up, but he raised one hand and they held because Nathaniel Graves was above all things a man who preferred to win through authority rather than through shooting, and a woman walking out of a cabin alone with papers in her hand was an authority situation. He looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, with the mild dismissive assessment of a man who has already categorized you and filed you away and doesn't expect to be surprised. "Rosie," he said, "put down the documents and we'll call this finished." She looked up at him. The cold was enormous, and the sky was that hard winter blue, and she was standing in the open in front of a man who had sent people to find her across 4 states. And she felt nothing like what she'd expected. Not terror, not the old familiar shrinking. Something that stood upright in her and looked back. "Those documents," she said clearly, "are already in Helena." He went very still on his horse. "Copies," she said. "I sent copies 3 weeks ago. Everything on these pages, every name, every amount, every date is sitting in the federal marshal's office in Helena right now, with a letter from me explaining exactly what it means." She watched his face. "Including the judge who signed your warrant." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had ever heard on a mountain. Then Nathaniel Graves said very quietly, "You're bluffing." "Am I?" she said, and she watched him look at her. Really look at her, maybe for the first time since she'd worked for him, and she watched him find in her face the thing he'd never thought to look for before a woman who had planned ahead. A woman who had been 3 moves ahead of him since February. A woman who had not run to Montana in desperation, but had run to Montana deliberately buying herself time to make sure the evidence was somewhere he couldn't reach it before she could get it to someone who could act on it. She watched him understand. And she watched the confidence go out of him slowly, the way heat goes out of a room when the fire dies, not all at once but steadily, inevitably, until what's left is just cold. "You have no idea," he said, and his voice had changed in a way that should have frightened her, and instead told her everything she needed to know about how this ended, what kind of people I can bring to bear on this. "Bring them," she said. "The marshal's office already has the list." Behind her, she heard the cabin door open. She heard Elias step out onto the porch. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. "Mr." Elias said to Graves in the voice he used when he had run out of patience for a conversation. "You're on my land. You've shot up my cabin. And you're talking to my wife like she owes you something." A pause. "She doesn't owe you a single thing. Ride out." Graves sat on his horse and looked at Rosie Carter standing in the frozen yard with 3 sheets of paper in her hand and a mountain at her back, and a man behind her who would not be moved, and he made the calculation that men like him make the one where they measure the cost against the reward and factor in what's already been lost. He turned his horse. His men followed. She stood there and watched them go until the sound of the hooves had gone completely silent and the mountain had taken the silence back as its own. Then she breathed. Just breathed for a long moment in and out, the cold air in and the warm air out, standing in the yard where nobody was shooting anymore. Elias came and stood beside her. Not in front, beside. "You sent copies," he said. "3 weeks ago," she said. "Before you trusted me." "Before I trusted you," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." He was quiet for a moment. "Don't be," he said. "You did exactly right." She turned and looked at him. Then this man who had stood in that doorway for her, who had spent 2 days preparing a defense of a cabin on a mountain, for a woman he'd known 3 weeks, who had come out behind her without her asking, and without making it about himself. And she said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "You swore," she said, "inside, when the bullet came through the wall." He looked at her, and this time the thing that moved through his face did not stop short of a smile. It arrived briefly, real and unguarded, and a little surprised at itself. "I did," he said. "I didn't know you could." "I try to keep it for occasions that warrant it," he said. She laughed. It came out ragged around the edges, the way laughter comes when it's been compressed under pressure for too long. But it came out, and she let it, and he stood beside her in the cold yard of a mountain cabin and listened to it. And when it was done, and the yard was quiet again, she looked up at the hard blue sky and thought, Graves was gone. But gone wasn't finished. A man with that much money and that much at stake didn't ride away and stay gone. He rode away and regrouped. He'd come back smarter and better prepared, and through channels she might not see in time. She needed the marshal in Helena to move. She needed it now. "Elias," she said. "I know," he said. He'd already been thinking it, she could tell from the quality of his quiet, the particular tension in his stillness that meant his mind was working fast under the surface. "I'll ride to Helena." "In this weather?" "I know a route," he said. "Longer, but safer. 3 days if the pass is open. And if it's not?" He looked at her steadily. "Then I go around." Oh. She looked back at the cabin, at the bullet hole in the front wall, the cold air leaking through it, the door standing open to the gray afternoon. She looked at the woodpile and the barn, and the trail up into the pines where she'd climbed 8 days ago, and stood in the high meadow for the first time, and felt for the first time like something the world hadn't managed to reduce to nothing. She pressed the 3 sheets of paper flat against her chest for a moment. Then she folded them carefully and tucked them back into the hidden seam. "Go," she said. "I'll hold the cabin." He looked at her. "Elias," she said. "Go." He went inside to pack. And Rosie Carter stood alone in that yard in the deep Montana cold, and she looked out at the road that Nathaniel Graves had ridden down, and she was not afraid. She was done being afraid. Whatever came next, the marshal, the trial, the long reach of a powerful man with money enough to be patient, she would meet it standing up with her name on it in a voice that did not lower for anyone. She had come to this mountain running. She stood in it now as something else entirely. Elias had been gone 4 hours when the rider came up the mountain road. Rosie heard the horse before she saw it. One horse moving fast, not the measured pace of someone who planned to be reasonable about whatever they'd come for. She was at the front window with the rifle in her hands before the sound had fully registered in her conscious mind, moving on instinct that 3 weeks on a mountain had built into her without her noticing. She looked through the shutter gap. One rider, young. She recognized him. The boy who worked the stable in Black Hollow couldn't have been more than 16. He pulled up hard in front of the cabin and called out, "Mrs. Boone, ma'am, it's Dale Holt. Gus Holt's nephew, I got a message." She lowered the rifle. She opened the door. The boy's face was red from the cold and tight with something that wasn't just the weather. He thrust an envelope toward her. "Came into town on the wire an hour ago." he said, breathing hard. Gus said I should write it up fast. She took it. Is there an answer? He said. Wait, she said. She broke the seal and read. It was from the Federal Marshal's office in Helena. 3 sentences. She read them twice, then a third time, slowly making sure she had every word right. Deputy marshals dispatched from Helena toward Black Hollow. Warrant issued for Nathaniel Graves on charges of wire fraud, wage theft, and obstruction of federal process. Documents received and verified. Expect arrival within 48 hours. She looked up at Dale Holt's waiting face. Tell your uncle thank you, she said. No answer needed. The boy nodded and turned his horse and went back down the mountain, and Rosie stood in the open doorway, with the cold coming in around her, and read the message a 4th time, and felt something shift in her chest. Not release. Not yet, the danger wasn't past. But something like the first change in air pressure that tells you the weather is turning. 48 hours. She needed to hold 2 more days. She went inside and banked the fire and checked both rifles and made herself eat something, because that was what you did when you were waiting for something serious. You kept your body functional, and you kept your mind occupied, and you did not sit still long enough to let the fear find a foothold. She did not sleep that night either. The second rider came the next morning, and this one was not a boy from the stable. He came up the road in official posture, the particular straight-backed way of a man who wears a badge and considers that sufficient protection from the world, and she recognized the county sheriff's star on his coat from 30 yards out. She knew his name from Black Hollow. Calhoun, a broad, careful man of about 50, who had the look of someone who'd spent his career being useful to whoever held the most power in the county. He stopped his horse in front of the cabin and called out, "Mrs. Boone, I have a warrant here for your arrest. I'd like you to come out, and come peaceable." She did not go out. "Under whose authority?" she called through the door. "Federal warrant, signed by Judge Artemis Hale out of Denver." Artemis Hale. The name on the second page of the documents, bottom of the column, $12,000 over 4 years. She opened the door. She stood in it, not out of it, with the rifle in her hands and the morning cold at her back, and she looked at Sheriff Calhoun on his horse. "Sheriff," she said, "do you know who Judge Hale is?" Calhoun shifted in his saddle. "I know he's a federal judge. He's also in the ledger I sent to Helena 3 weeks ago. $12,000 received from Nathaniel Graves between 1872 and 1876. She watched his face. "Deputy marshals are riding from Helena right now with a warrant for Graves. I'd expect them inside 36 hours. That warrant in your hand, the one signed by the judge who took Graves' money, is going to be evidence in a federal proceeding." She paused. "Is that what you want your name attached to?" Calhoun was quiet for a long moment. "Graves paid you to come up here," she said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you I understand that. He's done it to men all over Chicago and Denver, and now he's doing it here because he does it everywhere, and he has always had enough money to make it work." She kept her voice level. "But the money he paid you with came from factory workers who never got their wages. Men like my father who worked himself to nothing and died not knowing anyone would ever know." She held the sheriff's gaze. "You can ride back down this mountain and tell Nathaniel Graves I wasn't home, or you can try to take me and explain to federal marshals in 36 hours why you were here." The silence stretched. Calhoun looked at the warrant in his hand. He looked at her. He looked at the mountains. He tucked the warrant into his coat. "I'll need to investigate the matter," he said in the careful tone of a man choosing words that don't commit him to anything. "You stay put, Mrs. Boone." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He turned his horse and rode back down the mountain, and Rosie watched him go with the rifle still in her hands and her pulse running harder than she let her face show. That was the second problem contained. But Graves was still out there, still moving, still working every angle available to him. And Elias had been gone a full day, and she had 36 hours to wait and no way to know what was happening on the road to Helena. She went inside and repaired the bullet hole in the front wall with a piece of oilcloth and 2 nails. She cleaned both rifles. She fed the animals. She made supper and ate half of it and put the rest in the pot for morning. She sat at the table with the 3 sheets of paper in front of her, and she read her father's name again. Thomas Carter, third row. Wages withheld 19 months. Amount $214. Her father had never made more than $4 a week in his life. He had worked at Graves Manufacturing for 11 years. He had coughed himself to death in a rented room on a street where the rent was going up every year, and he had died believing the accounting was simply how things worked, that the math between a man's labor and a man's wages was not something a working man had any say in. She folded the papers back into the seam. She pressed her hand flat against her coat over the place where they rested. "I know, Papa," she said to the empty cabin. "I know." The second day was the hardest. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. The hours moved with the particular cruelty of hours that are waiting for something slow and heavy and full of the sounds of the mountain going about its indifferent business, while she sat in a cabin wondering whether Elias had made the pass, whether the road had held, whether something had gone wrong in a way she had no way of knowing from up here. By mid-morning she had run out of tasks to keep herself occupied and was reduced to chopping wood she didn't need yet, just for something to do with her hands and her body. And it was in the middle of this that she understood clearly and without sentimentality that she was frightened, not for herself. She had made her peace with her own danger somewhere around the moment she'd walked out that cabin door to face Nathaniel Graves. She was frightened for Elias. It surprised her the clarity of it. She had known this man 21 days. She had married him by advertisement and met him stepping off a stagecoach, and she had known him through rifle lessons and mountain trails, and a siege that had lasted 2 hours in a cold Montana morning. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she had stopped being a woman in a house with a man who was not cruel and had become something else, something that had no clean name yet, but felt when she turned it over carefully in her mind, like the first foundations of something she had not believed she would ever be allowed to build. She wanted him to come back. She set the axe against the block and went inside. He came back on the morning of the third day, and he was not alone. She heard the horses multiple too many for Graves, the wrong kind of purposeful, and she was at the front window before the sound had resolved, and she looked through the shutter gap, and she counted 4 riders, and then she saw the stars on 3 of their coats, and she exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 days. She opened the door. Elias was on his horse at the left of the group, and she saw immediately that something was wrong with how he was sitting. The particular careful stillness of a man holding himself upright through effort rather than ease. His coat was dark on the left side, in a way that dried blood makes things dark. She crossed the yard to him without stopping on the porch. "Elias?" "I'm all right," he said. "You are not all right." "It's a graze," he said. "Left side, high. It looks worse than it is. Get down from that horse." He got down, and she could see how much the movement cost him, though he made no sound about it. She put her shoulder under his arm without asking, and he accepted it without argument, which told her more about the extent of it than anything he would have said. The lead marshal, a broad, capable man named Cross, with gray in his beard and steady eyes, dismounted and introduced himself and told her briefly what had happened. Graves's men had hit Elias on the road south of the pass, 2 of them. They'd been waiting, which meant Graves had guessed the route, which meant Graves had been smarter than they'd given him credit for in the immediate aftermath of the cabin confrontation. Elias had gotten through anyway. He'd kept moving, bleeding through the night, and reached the marshal's outpost at dawn, and put the documents in Cross's hands before he'd let them look at the wound. "He wouldn't let us stop," Cross said. And there was something in how he said it, a flat factual respect, that told her the marshal was a man who knew what that kind of stubbornness cost, and understood what it was worth. "Where is Graves now?" she said. "Black Hollow," Cross said. "We arrested him this morning, him and 2 of his men." He paused. "The warrant from Judge Hale has been suspended pending federal review of Hale's conduct. Sheriff Calhoun is cooperating." She absorbed that. "And the documents?" "Entered into federal evidence." Cross looked at her steadily. "You're going to need to testify, Mrs. Boone, in Denver. We'll need you there for the proceedings." "I know," she said. "It won't be comfortable," he said. "Graves has lawyers." "He has always had lawyers," she said. "I have the truth. I'll take my chances. She got Elias inside and onto the bed. He would have argued, but she didn't give him the opportunity, just moved him toward it with the same practical efficiency she'd applied to everything on this mountain. And she cleaned the wound, which was a graze, the way a winter in Montana was a mild inconvenience, deep enough to matter, and long enough to have bled freely for 6 hours. He watched her work. She didn't talk, and he didn't talk, and the silence between them was the silence it had been since the first night, not empty. Just two people being honest with each other without requiring words for it. "You held the cabin," he said finally. "I told you I would." Calhoun came up. He did. She tied off the bandage. He went back down. "How'd you manage that?" "I told him the truth and let him decide what kind of man he wanted to be when the marshals arrived." She sat back. "He made the right choice. Men usually do when someone makes the stakes clear enough." Elias looked at her for a moment. "You sent those copies before you trusted me," he said. "We've established that." "I've been thinking about it," he said. "On the road. Most people would have called that a betrayal, keeping something back." "And you," she said. He held her eyes. "I think a woman who's been given every reason to trust no one and still finds a way to protect herself without hurting anyone else is—" He stopped. He looked at the ceiling and started again. "I think that's the most capable thing I've ever seen a person do," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed beside him, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and the fire was low, and the cabin was holding its warmth against the cold, and outside, the marshal's men were setting up camp for the night, and the mountain was the mountain. "Elias," she said. "Yeah." "When this is over—" She stopped. She tried again. "When it's settled, the trial, all of it. I don't want to go back to Chicago." He was quiet. "I want to stay," she said. "Here, on this mountain." She looked at him carefully. If that's something you want as well." He looked at the ceiling again for long enough that she thought she'd misjudged, that she'd moved too fast, or assumed too much, or read something in him that wasn't there. "Rosie," he said, "you don't have to." "I have wanted that," he said, "since about the 4th day." He said it the way he said everything plainly, without inflation as fact. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to think I expected it." She looked at him, lying in that bed with a wound along his left side that he'd ridden through for 6 hours in the dark to put her evidence in the right hands, and she thought about all the ways a person could show you who they were without ever making a speech about it. "Get some sleep," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and closed his eyes. She sat beside him until his breathing evened out. Then she got up and went back to the front room and sat at the table and thought about Denver. The trial came 6 weeks later. She rode down from the mountain in a coat she'd mended twice, and boots Elias had resoled in the cabin by firelight the week before they left. And she walked into the federal courthouse in Denver with her name and her face and 3 sheets of paper that she handed over to the prosecutor's clerk with steady hands. The courtroom was full. Graves's lawyers were expensive. They worked hard. They asked their questions in the particular way of lawyers who have been paid enough to make a woman doubt what she knows, circling back on small details, pressing on dates, implying through tone what they couldn't prove through fact. She answered every question. She did not hurry. She did not lower her eyes. The moment that stopped, the room came on the 2nd day of testimony. Graves's lead attorney, a man named Whitfield Silverhaired, practiced formidable, stood in front of her and said in a voice designed to carry to the jury, "Miss Carter, forgive me. Mrs. Boone, isn't it true that you entered private offices without authorization to obtain these documents?" "Yes," she said. He paused. He hadn't expected her to say yes so simply. "And yet you present yourself as a woman who broke into her employer's office," she said, "to copy evidence of 15 years of theft from men who had no other way to prove what was being done to them." She looked directly at the jury, not at Whitfield, at the 12 men who were going to decide this. "My father's name is on that 2nd page. He worked at Graves Manufacturing for 11 years. He died owing rent, He should have had the wages to pay on wages Nathaniel Graves withheld and recorded in a ledger he thought no one without a last name like his would ever see. She let the courtroom hold